Worldwide Bible Class. I'm Pastor Bryan Wolfmueller. Today is April the 19th. We are studying Genesis chapter 30 together with Martin Luther, the life of Jacob, with Luther taking us into the text. Let's get after it. So here we are. Let me get back to where I am instead of where we should be. Here we are in chapter 30 now. Oh, look at this. We are about to see the family of Jacob growing like crazy. So here we see Abraham and Sarah, who have one. There's Isaac. And then Isaac and Rebekah, who have two twins, Jacob and Esau. Now Jacob is he's 80, remember, 80 years old. And he tries to marry Rachel, ends up getting married to Leah, then to Rachel a week later, and then they each have maidservants, and so the children start to arrive. Last week, at the end of chapter 30, we had the first three from Jacob and Leah, Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, and this is where we're gonna enter into the fray here in chapter 30, and Rachel. Oops, sorry, with Leah there. So then Rachel is, boy, I wish I had some children. And so Rachel gives her maidservant to Jacob, and now are born Dan. Wait a minute. Is that right? Let me go down a little bit just to make sure I'm reading this. Dan and Naphtali. Yep. So we have, whoops. So we have 1, 2, 3, then 4, 5, and then I just can't remember the order here. This is one of the things that I should try to do, is remember the ordering of all of these births, but this is a hard thing for my own mind. Didn't we? Naphtali. Then Leah sees that she stops bearing. She took Zilpah, her maid, and now Zilpah, who is, so Bilhah is connected to Rachel. Zilpah is connected to Leah. So Leah isn't having children. Rachel wasn't having children. Now Bilhah has children, and now Leah gives Zilpah to Jacob. And so then we have 6, Gad, 7, Asher. And then, so then we have this business with the mandrakes. So Rachel wants some mandrakes from Reuben. And oops, someone's correcting me. Jill says Judah's number 4. Thank you. There's 4 at the beginning. Thank you for that correction. Let's just clean this up here. That's right. Judah. Then there's a break. Then we have Dan, Naphtali, 7, 8. And so then there's this business with the mandrakes. So after Asher, we're going to go back down here a little bit, and Rachel and Leah are fighting about the mandrakes. And so Leah buys Jacob. Sheesh. And so then she starts to have more children. So we have Issachar. This would be 9, 10. And then Dinah will be the 11th child. Let's say 1 for the first girl. So we'll have our numbers right. And then at last, Rachel is going to give birth to child number 11, Joseph. And then, not until we're in chapter 30 here, in chapter 35, there's a lot of ground to cover. Rachel is going to give birth to Jacob's 12th boy, Benjamin, and she dies in that childbirth. So we're headed towards all the birth of the 11 that are there. Now, we include Manasseh and Ephraim on this family tree of Jacob. I mean, I don't include it, but they included it here, because you'll remember that when the tribes are being distinguished, the 2 sons of Joseph are considered tribes. Each of them becomes a tribe. So there is no Joseph tribe, but there's the tribe of Manasseh and the tribe of Ephraim. The half tribe of Manasseh, which I used to think that the half tribe of Manasseh was because he was one half and Ephraim was another half. But I believe that the half-tribe business has to do with the fact that when the land was allocated, Manasseh's territory was divided into two. So there's two sections. I think that's what the half-tribe is referring to. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. So with this family, and you notice how small this is. Esau has a handful of wives, two, maybe then three wives, and he's having children over here. But remember, the promise is going from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. And now Jacob, I mean, just last week in our study, Jacob was 80 years old and single. But now, all of a sudden, he's not single. He's the opposite of single. He has 4 wives, and no longer does he not have a family. He's got this big, massive family. So just when you think things are not working out, then now there's a lot of children. Now, this promise, by the way, is going to extend from Jacob then to Judah, which is a surprise. You think maybe the promise would go to the firstborn, although it never seems to go to the firstborn, or maybe the promise would go to Joseph. After all, he's going to be the focus of the attention. But no, the promise goes to Judah, and then from Judah becomes the line of kings, and then the promise goes to King David. So there you go. Okay, now let's check out what Luther's talking about. So we are in Luther's Works, chapter 30, and let's just read a little bit of the Bible first. Now, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, "Give me children, or else I die." And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" So remember, Jacob loves Rachel, but Rachel can't have any children, or so far is unable to have children, whereas Leah has now 4 children, and Rachel would rather die than not have children. So Rachel says, "Here's my maid Bilhah. Go unto her, she will bear a child on my knees, that I also may have children by her." She gave him Bilhah, her maid, as wife. Notice, as wife. And Jacob went into her, and Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, "God has judged my case, and he has also heard my voice and given me a son." Therefore, she called his name Dan, judge. That's what Dan means. Daniel means God is judge. Dan is. How come it doesn't tell us what it means? It just tells us all the people named Dan. Anyway. So there's Dan. And Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then when Rachel said, "With great wrestling I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed." So there's a lot of wrestling that's happening in this family. So she called his name Naphtali. Now, so Bilhah has these 2 children, and Leah saw that. So she's she is barren. Now she's not having any children. So she's gonna get into this game. And so she's going to give her maidservant, Zilpah, as Jacob's wife. So when Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob as wife. Again, notice as wife. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "A troop comes." So she called his name Gad, which I guess means troop. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, "I'm happy, for the daughters will call me blessed." So she called his name Asher, blessed. Okay, so here's how things are going in the family here. Susan mentions, "I cannot understand the multiple wife thing." Yes, we're gonna get to that. It is let's make this note. It was never intended by God for a man to have multiple wives. The Lord instituted marriage, and he said, "So a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the 2 shall become one." This is the mathematics of marriage. 2 becoming 1, not 5 becoming 4 sets of 1, as we have here with Jacob. And that's how the Lord intended it. when especially we see kings who are interested in having these huge families, then these kings end up taking for themselves multiple wives, and it almost always goes poorly. And we see that going poorly here also. This is not this chapter 30 is not a picture of bliss. In fact, Luther's going to point out later, when this is down in chapter 31, verse 40, when Jacob is describing this whole business to Laban, and he says, there I was in the day the drought consumed me, and frost by night, and my sleep departed from my eyes. In other words, this whole business was exhausting. This whole thing was crazy. So we'll come back. This is not this picture of, like, I don't know how, for whatever reason, when we think of Jacob or of a man having these multiple wives, we think of this sort of palace of indulgence. And that is not what this is a picture of. It's a picture of strife. It's a picture of hardship. It's a picture of it's not a lusty picture. It's a picture of survival. So this is what we want to get to. And Luther's going to talk about that here. So let me let Luther introduce it, and then I'll skip a few sections from Luther, and I'll tell you why I'm skipping it, and then we'll come back. This is one of the most obscure chapters of the book so far, as the words, the meaning, and the history are concerned. Accordingly, many questions pertaining both to the grammar and especially to the history present themselves. The latter, the grammar questions, are far more difficult than the former, just in terms of translating the Hebrew is what Luther's talking about. But lest we seem to pass by them completely, let us do what we can. In the first place, the question arises in the eyes of carnal and Epicurean men who regard these histories as examples of extreme baseness. Now, let's remember Epicurean. It's helpful for us to have this word Epicurean in our vocab. Epicurus was a philosopher, Greek philosopher. They're all Greek philosophers. Epicurus taught that the goal of life was, well, not pleasure, but the absence of pain, that we should have an untroubled life. And his thing was that the two major ideas that trouble, the things that trouble us are not physical conditions, but ideas. And the two ideas that trouble us most are the idea, number one, that the gods, remember Greek pantheon and everything, that the gods are involved in this life, that the gods intervene, and also that there's an afterlife. There's judgment after death, and we're punished for the bad things. And Epicurus said that these two ideas are the most troubling ideas, and so we have to throw them out. Even Epicurus would say, even if there are gods who are involved, and even if there is a judgment and an afterlife, that we have to ignore it. Now, Epicurus himself was sort of an ascetic. He kind of lived in the woods, and he would talk about the dangers of indulgence that actually steals joy and stuff like this. But it didn't take long for Epicureanism to be grabbed a hold of by our own sinful flesh, and it became a kind of hedonism. So there was a poet who really popularized Epicureanism. Starts with an L. One of you will know his name. And he popularized it in poems, and he became it's kind of a hedonistic Epicureanism. And their creed became, let us eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And death is just the end of everything. So Epicureanism in Luther is a shorthand for this: eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. It's a shorthand for the pursuit of pleasure. It's the idea that the best life is the life where our bellies are unchained. Paul says it like this: your God is your belly. Peter says, whatever you serve, you're a slave to. If we chase after our desires, we become slaves to lust, and so forth and so on. That kind of basic understanding freedom and slavery. Well, Epicureanism reverses that. It says, no, freedom is freedom to pursue your own lusts and desires. And we live largely, this is why it's so helpful for us, we live largely in an Epicurean culture. I mean, the just do it kind of thing, the who are you to tell me who I can and can't love, that's just, it's almost pure hedonism, pure Epicureanism, which we have to fight against. So Luther's going to talk about it. The Epicurean men who regard these histories as examples of extreme baseness. So they see in these stories just Jacob chasing after his lusts, so forth. Jacob marries 2 sisters, and in addition, what did it say? 2 of their maidservants. He's the husband of 4 wives. Therefore, they judge Jacob according to their own character and represent him as exceedingly lustful and completely devoted to the love of women day and night, since he could not be content with 1 wife, but married 4. As a result, they greatly offend and seize opportunity to blaspheme and praise their own celibacy in opposition to the licentiousness and lusts, as they think, of the saintly patriarchs, especially of Jacob. This is the reading of those who prized celibacy. Now, let me finish the paragraph and then but these judgments of theirs are like those of a pig or an ass would pronounce on some illustrious lutenist. In other words, what kind of judgment? This is actually kind of funny. What does your dog think of Bach? What does the pig think of Yo-Yo Ma? This is what Luther's saying. He says these guys don't even have the capacity to think rightly about Jacob. They're so sold in their lust, that so given over to their own baseness, that they can't even begin to understand what Jacob is going through. They are the kind of people who are completely abandoned to lust, whoredom, and adultery, who dream day and night only of their sexual fun, and imagine what they would do if such license were granted to them, that they would be able to change wives every night and have fun with them according to the flames and ardent desires of the flesh, as they have fun with their harlots. They do not distinguish the saintly life of married people from their own whoredom. Now, here's a very interesting problem that arose in medieval Catholicism, and I don't think it's gone away, and that is that when the monks committed themselves to celibacy, that celibacy was, on the one hand, understood just to be, I'm not going to get married, but it didn't mean I wouldn't go visit women. The commandment, you shall not commit adultery, could only be broken if you were, after all, married. So there would be the monastery, and then there would be the prostitutes, the harlots. And this was a common practice. There was a more strict understanding, which Luther would have had, and the Augustinians would have had, which had to do with actually, no, you're not supposed to touch a woman or ever be together with a woman. When you go to Augsburg, for example, and you see the church where the monks were in Augsburg, there was a veil where the monks would worship up front and the people from the city would worship in back, and they had a curtain there so that the men wouldn't even look at the women. So there was a chastity, which meant that the men were to be celibate. But even that celibacy was stained with lust, and Luther talks about it here of, like, they are not married or doing anything, but they dream about it. They still have this lusty fire burning in them. And Luther's going to say that's not a true celibacy. It's not a true continence. It was a forced chastity. And so Luther's going to talk about this for a long time. And it has all the marks, just by the way, of the Catholic priests who still are talking about this, because they have to wrestle day and night with the fact that they are men who are trying to practice celibacy that goes against the natural pressure of their own bodies. And so there's all these conversations with the monks, and also even currently with priests and so forth, about what happens in your dreams, what happens in your own desires, even if you don't act on them, etc. And Luther's going to say it's not a complete chastity because there's still lust, the flame of lust operating in your own body. So I'll skip over those paragraphs because it's all this kind of, I mean, it's important for especially young men to think about this, but if there's young men who want to talk about it later, we can talk about it. What follows is what has been stated above about Jacob's countenance gives evidence that he lived in complete chastity. So Jacob did not have all of these wives because he was a playboy, because he was some sort of lusty fellow. For it is not continence to live up for is it not continence to live as a celibate up to the 80th year of one's life and to practice continence, not out of compulsion, but because the Spirit wants it? So he says, look, for 80 years, Jacob was not married, was single, was chaste. Do the same thing from your earliest years up to old age, and we will praise your celibacy. So Luther says to these monks who are mocking Jacob, he says, you do that for 80 years, and then we can praise your celibacy. For there is no glory in papistical celibacy if it's compared with the chastity of the patriarchs. Later, however, we'll hear how Jacob complains about his difficult and troublesome life when he expostulates with Laban. By day, he says, the heat consumed me, and the cold by night, and sleep fled from my eyes. That's the passage I showed you earlier. So this is not Jacob is not some sort of Herodian palace where the soft carpets are laid out and there's all sorts of debauchery happening. Jacob is mostly out in the fields. Here he describes his whole way of life, which he did not spend without cares, toils, and troubles. He did not loaf in idleness at home near the fire and play with Leah, but day and night he was compelled to be away from home, to pasture the cattle, to carry out all the duties connected with the cattle, probably sheep, but cattle understood as ruminants. He suffered cold and heat under the open sky and very seldom came to his tent. He lived outside. He was there in the fields. His wives were home. He was not. He was a slave to Laban all these years. This should drive away the itch even when one is young. Living outside in the tent takes away the itch. Here's Luther's, he's talking about lust. Therefore, Jacob lived most contentedly with so many wives, and far more chastely than anyone else with one wife. For to burn by day, to freeze by night, to be overwhelmed by toils and foreign and difficult servitude under the unfair and greedy master is surely a great and intolerable burden. Therefore, Lyra rightly excuses Jacob for living continently and for associating temperately with his wives and maidservants, for he associated them only out of love for offspring. And here we're gonna capture a theme, and we're gonna want to keep this in mind as the commentary unfolds here. Is the thing that's driving Jacob, as also the thing that's driving Leah and Rachel, even though there's their own sinful flesh is mixed in here, is in fact desire for and faith in the promise that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. So Jacob has the promise that his seed will bless the nations. From his seed, the Messiah will come. That's great. And that's going to be one of the driving forces. And even though Rachel is now going to show herself to be envious, her envy is also connected to this promised seed. So we're going to temper our judgment of Rachel and Jacob a little bit, because I suppose the same with Abraham, because while they're sinning in their mistakes, for example, Abraham sins when he goes into Hagar. His sin is out of reflecting on the promise of the gospel and that his seed would bless the nations of the earth. Kat says, that's awesome. They had faith in the seed. That's why they're competing to have babies. Let's see how Luther says it. This is also apparent in these anxious wishes of the women. For see how anxiously they make advances to their husband in order that they may be able to have offspring. Therefore, he was very seldom in the tents of his wives, and he lived with his wives in the purest love of offspring. And we see that it is for the sake of offspring that he loves Leah, who previously was hated and despised, and that he associates more with her than with Rachel after he notices that she is fruitful. This, then, is how we shall reply to the first question of the passage and stop the mouths of the exceedingly filthy people who judge the marriages of the patriarchs according to their own lusts and impure celibacy. The second question, which had been dealt with previously, namely, that beside the two sisters, he also marries two maidservants. Although I make no positive statement, yet in that age it seems to have been the custom of that region for barren wives to hand their maidservants over to their husbands. So Luther says it looks like this was the custom because they needed children so bad. If something happened where a man and his wife were unable to have children, then the wife's maidservant would basically bear the children for the wife. And that child would then be adopted into the family, or it'd be part of the family. It would expand the family in that way. Thus Laban, and it happened with Sarah and Hagar. It happens now with Rachel and Leah, both of their maidservants. Luther says, I don't want to make a positive statement about that, but it seems like from the pattern here, we can pick up that this was customary in those times. Thus Laban adds a maidservant to both of his daughters, perhaps to the end that in case their daughter did not give birth, the maidservant might take her place, and that the house might be built from her. Thus above, Sarah gave her maidservant to Abraham, not a strange maid, but one from her own house and domestics. Isaac did not follow this custom. So Isaac and Rebekah seem to be the most normal couple in this way. Hagar and Sarah, you have his parents, and then you have now his son Jacob and Esau both have multiple wives. But Isaac and Rebekah, just the two of them, the whole time. It's kind of cool. Nor would Jacob have employed it if it had not been deceived by Laban and the woman had not demanded it so emphatically. So Luther says here that Jacob would have just had Rachel and that would have been it. Problem is that he gets deceived and all starts to go kind of crazy. For one must also consider that at that time, fertility was regarded as an extraordinary blessing and a special gift of God, as is clear from Deuteronomy 28, where Moses numbers fertility among the blessings that God would give. Blessed shall be the fruit of your womb and the fruit of your ground and the fruit of your cattle, the increase of your herds and the young of your flock. Exodus 23, there'll be no barren among you. We do not regard this fertility so highly today, although we like and desire it in cattle and in the fields and so forth. Yet in the human race, there are few who regard a woman's fertility as a blessing. Indeed, there are many who have an aversion for it and regard sterility as a special blessing. I mean, boy, it's like Luther's alive today. So Luther's saying that, look, it's a bad deal that in their day, they did not regard fertility as the blessing from God, but rather sterility. If you can't have kids, that's great, and so forth. We've made sterility not only a blessing in our own age, we've made sterility a human right. That you have the right to be not pregnant. It's insanity. Surely this is also contrary to nature, says Luther. Much less is it pious and saintly. For this affection has been implanted by God in man's nature, so that it desires its increase and multiplication. Accordingly, it is inhuman and godless to have a loathing for offspring. This is, strangely enough, this is our whole political platform, is babies are good. I mean, that's like, if you wanted my political perspective, this is all it is. Babies are good. Thus, someone recently called it, this is Luther must have heard one of his students. Someone recently called his wife a sow, since she gave birth rather often, the good for nothing and impure fellow. the same, there must, I mean, they're sitting around drinking beer, and there's a man they're saying, hey, you're having your sixth kid or whatever. And he says, yeah, my wife's a sow. And Luther probably slapped him on the face. Good for nothing, impure fellow. The saintly fathers did not feel like this at all, for they acknowledged a fruitful wife as a special blessing of God, and on the other hand, regarded sterility as a curse. And the judgment flowed from the word of God, Genesis 1:28, where he said, be fruitful and multiply. From this, they understood that children are a gift from God. Clark says, if they didn't have children, there'd be no one to take care of them in their old age. Same is true for today. Now, look, everybody's in a different spot in life. Everyone's in a different place in this. There was, and my own life has been, I think, on the edge of this realization. But I think in my parents' age, and you go back even to my grandparents, you go back a couple generations, and the big scare was of overpopulation. And in comes birth control, and in comes Planned Parenthood, maybe not the organization, but the idea. And in comes the picture of the perfect family as a man and his wife and a son and a daughter and a dog and a cat. And so you have the sort of the ideal of the nuclear family is shrunk down. And people were under the assumption that was good. And it just caught hold of the American imagination. And it probably, caught hold. I have two brothers, so I've got a family of 5. And that was kind of there weren't many families bigger than that when I was growing up. And I kind of had that idea as well. When we had 4 children, we have 4 children, that was like, whoa, that's a pretty big family. I think we've, at least in the Lutheran Church, we kind of passed that idea, that idea of the nuclear family that captured our imagination has now burst. And the idea of having large families is kind of, at least in conservative Lutheran circles, has captured people's imaginations again. And that's good. There's a great damage. I mean, people have always had birth control and methods to avoid becoming pregnant and so forth. Some of them very crude and etc. There's always been abortions and exposures. So there's always been drugs that were used to try to end pregnancy. There's always been physical methods. And then the Romans would just, when the kids were born, they just leave them outside. So they just infanticide, kill the kids. There's always been that. The thing that happened in our own day, especially with the insertion of the pill into all of our stuff, is that you have this disconnect with sex and pregnancy. And that disconnect has been pushed into our own imaginations in such that intimacy and responsibility are almost opposite from one another rather than being joined together. So the idea of marriage is all kind of confused as well. But I think it's one of the signs of hope that I see, that these young Lutheran families are having lots of kids. You got lots of families with 7, 8 kids, and it's not so strange anymore. And it's something that we can rejoice in. Now, our culture still has, that aversion to fertility, though. And so that's something. Let me say one more thing pastorally. Understanding again that everyone's in different situations. Some of you were never married, and some of you would have liked to have been married, and the Lord never provided a spouse. Some of you were married and had small families, maybe wanted bigger families, or you couldn't have children at all. Some of you, many people have expressed this to me, Pastor, I wish I would have had more children, but I was just in that, it was just the way it was back then, is you had 2 kids and then you stopped. So as I've been with people who have been aging and dying, there's a very different quality of death depending on the number of children that you have. And there's a very different quality of aging depending on the number of children that you have. So if you don't have any children, it's a lonely thing. If you have 4 or 5 children, your deathbed is like a rowdy place. Like, it's like nobody even notices when you die. It sounds bad, but like when your family's all there and they're all messing with each other and all the grandkids are talking and stuff. And then you look over and like, oh, it looks like mom died. Praise the Lord. And you sing the doxology. It becomes, so this idea that the children are taking care of you in your old age is a pretty important thing. And someone made the point that if you don't have children, then the government thinks that it has to step in. I would hope that the church would step in. And so one of the things for those who are single, those who are widows or widowers, those who don't have many children, is you have to adopt. I mean, not legally, but you have to adopt families in church so that you have your church children, and you got to give them Christmas presents, and then they'll come and see you when you're dying. This is the point. But it's, when we think about having children, for whatever reason, because we're just kind of addicted to today and tomorrow, and we forget that there's a next week and a next year, we think, boy, having children is really difficult. And fair enough, it is. That's why the Lord gives us children when we're young. But getting old is also difficult. And the children, when the care flips, and you're at the end of your life, and the children and the grandchildren are caring for you, the more the better. So having lots of children is an insurance policy. It's like a retirement plan. That's how we should think of it. Now, we have to think about this as the same thing in Luther's day. Be fruitful and multiply. That's the text that we're talking about here. And so this is the command that we have from the Lord: be fruitful and multiply. Now, does this mean, let me just come back to this clearly. Does this mean that there is no family planning for Christians? Maybe, but I don't think I want to say a hard yes on that. There is a place that our human wisdom can come into this, but it should be the exception rather than the rule. So I think there's a place for wisdom about, is this enough children for us, and things like that, especially when it comes to mom's health and etc. But for the Christian marriage is always open to the gift of children, and the Christian marriage is always geared towards the gift of children, and the Christian recognizes that intimacy and responsibility go together. So when the Lord institutes marriage, he says, a man shall leave his father and his mother. And you have to say at that point that Adam would say, what's a father? In other words, marriage, to be a husband is to be a father, and to be a wife is to be a mother. Those vocations go together. They're inseparable. And that's why we call marriage the rite of holy matrimony, the rite of holy mothering, of becoming a mother. So a wife is a mother even before the children are arriving, and the husband. So there's ideas like, well, I'm ready to be married, but I'm not ready to have children. You can't. They're just in the Lord's mind, they go together. Now, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you're married and you don't have children. Sometimes you're 80 years old and you get married and children don't come along. But in the Lord's, in the normal course of things, those two things belong together, and they belong together in our own Christian imagination. Good? Okay. Now, where are we here? 45. Furthermore, so let's get back to this business here. Furthermore, this is an example or deed according to which maidservants were handed over in place of wives who were barren should not become a precedent. In other words, Luther says this is not this here, Rachel giving Bilhah to Jacob, is not an example that we want to follow. No one should say, Jacob did this, therefore I'll also be permitted to me. It's been stated above about Munzer, who urged the peasants to slay their princes according to the example of Joshua and Samson. But remember that you must abide by the rule, each man should have his own wife. 1 Corinthians 7. That's the rule. If you want to be like Joshua and Samson, see to it also that all the circumstances impel you to change the civil administration and slay the magistrate, just as those heroes were moved by a special call. Remember last time we spent a long time talking about this special call. The heroes are exempt from the rules because they're heroes, but we are not heroes. Otherwise, their examples have no validity. For you have more and greater examples which to testify that one should not slay a magistrate, should not change the civil administration. Accordingly, you, like the other subjects, must be obedient to the government, for you have not been accepted from the rule. Therefore, remain in obedience. Do not become a hero like Munzer and others. Accordingly, this is handed down to us not as an example, but in order that we may abstain from the example and from imitating it. We should admire, but not imitate it. For there are some things which we should imitate, and some things which we should admire. Hope, believe, pray, just as Leah did. But you should not marry 4 wives, as Jacob did. So this has to have this distinction between what do we imitate and what do we admire. This pertains only to Jacob and to those to whom God wanted to be exempted from the rule. We should exercise ourselves in faith, patience, and hope set forth in the fathers, and we should abstain from those heroic examples. These are the questions that had to be examined at the beginning of the chapter. Now let us look at the text. So here we're going to have to deal with the envy and the hatred of Rachel for Leah. And how is it that these saintly women, Luther says, could be given over to this kind of jealousy and envy and hatred? Now, this is a long this is a long bit here. So I think this is probably a good spot to stop for today, because I'd like to take this all of one piece. So we'll finish the recording here. If you're watching this as a recording and you're not watching and you're not joining us live, wolfmueller.co/worldwide Bible class has the information when to join us live. And that's a lot of fun, because as soon as I stop the recording, then we all jump on and ask questions, and I get, that's really the most fun part. That's where I get to follow your guys' lead too as well. So try to join us live if you're watching this on the recording. Otherwise, we'll